Good morning. So glad to see all of you here this morning. Everybody looks reasonably awake. My name is Jay Westbrook. I'm on the faculty here at the law school, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you to what I think is going to be a really terrific panel. I gather there was a lot of talk. I couldn't come yesterday, but I gather there was a lot of talk about debt yesterday, and that's music to my ears. I teach bankruptcy, and people often ask me the cause of bankruptcy, and of course the answer is debt. So it's a pleasure to be with you here this morning. I'll just say this one introductory comment. My co-author, the demographer, Teresa Sullivan, who's now president of the University of Virginia, when we first drug her into talking about debt, her people in the sociology department says, "This is ridiculous. We don't write about debt in sociology. We write about wealth." And she said, "Can't you see there's a connection between the two?" So it's a particular pleasure for me to be here. I'm going to briefly introduce our panel. All four of them are very distinguished, interesting folks. I'm not going to go through all of that. You have biographies in front of you. So I'll just mention each one of them. To my immediate right is Mechele Dickerson, my colleague here at the University of Texas Law School. On my far right is Owen Taylor from the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. On my immediate left is Raj Patel, who's at the LBJ School across the street, and we're very glad to have him there. And on my far left is Vasuki Nesiah. I apologize if I said that wrong, who comes to us from NYU. So it's a very distinguished panel, a very interesting subject, and we'll start off with Mechele.
Thank you, Jay, and thank you to the organizers who are right here of this conference. It's a wonderful opportunity to be able to talk about inequality with two worlds that often don't talk to each other because we sort of approach things from a very different perspective. My current research focuses on the disappearing middle class in the United States. So the paper that I've written will focus both on growing inequality, both wealth and income, and those gaps, the sort of inequality gaps. But also I'm going to talk a lot about sort of rising household debt loads because they are crushing now the middle class in this country. It's always been a problem for poor people in the country, but now it's affecting the middle class as well. So the human rights community, as I was preparing, doing the research for this paper, hasn't really chimed in a lot on the economic inequality gaps. And I think it's because up until now, when we've talked about income inequality, we've really focused on the top, sort of what's going on with the top 1%. And the human rights community and the principles that guide you all sort of focuses on the bottom, alleviating poverty. How can we provide basic human rights to liberty, to life, to be educated, to be clothed, to be housed? So my paper will argue that the human rights community should be concerned about the growing economic gaps, the income and wealth gaps, because what is happening at the top, with the top 1%, is pushing a lot of people in the middle to the bottom. For the first time in 50 years, the middle class or middle class households are no longer the majority of U.S. households. So what we're seeing is wealth going to the top, and I'll talk a bit about that in just a moment. The middle class shrinking, or as I say, vanishing, and then all sorts of really unfortunate things happening to people who are at the bottom of the economic rungs in this country. One of the things that I'll specifically focus on toward the end of the paper is how the gap between the middle class, shrinking though it is, and the lower class is now having profoundly negative effects on educational outcomes for poor children. First, the gaps. There's always been an income inequality. There's always been income inequality in this country. There have always been gaps, and there always will be. What's challenging now is that the gaps are enormous, and they appear to be growing for reasons that have nothing to do with the workers' efforts or talents. So we used to think sort of hard work, determination, and sort of playing by the rules, that's enough for you to get ahead. And what we're seeing now is that's just not true. That's not enough for people to have upward economic mobility. So income is increasingly concentrated in the top 1%. They have a larger share of total income that's being earned in the country. They're the only workers who consistently have had raises over the last 20 or 30 years. And even though they lost income during the recession, most of their income losses were driven by stock market losses. Because of that, they've mostly rebounded. They've gained most of the losses that they suffered during the recession. In contrast, middle income and poor people, the losses were because you lost your job. And so they haven't recouped the losses from the recession because theirs was driven by unemployment, as opposed to your stock portfolio took a little bit of a dip during the recession. Wealth. I found there was an article that Forbes magazine put out last year when it was discussing the Forbes 400. And so I'm going to use something from that article just to show you how profound the wealth gap is. And it involves cats. So, show of hands, how many of you own cats? Okay. So, Forbes said the typical U.S. household has about $81,000 in wealth. There are about 36 million households that are cat households. So let's assume that all 36 million households have an average of $81,000 in wealth. If you multiply that, the 81,000 times the 36 million in households, that's the wealth that's held by the richest 400 households in the country. So that's the magnitude of the wealth gap. Average household wealth times all the number of households that own cats. But I want to focus also on the debt side. Because in addition to not receiving our fair share, for middle income and poor people not receiving fair shares of income, they're also struggling with higher debt loads. And I'll focus on just a couple of the types of debts that are really choking the middle class and poor people. The biggest one is housing. Housing is the largest form of household expenses, sort of the largest household expense. And housing unaffordability has been a problem for decades. Now, we were able to mask the problem. We put a lot of makeup and, pretty paint on the problem during the housing boom. And we did that by saying we need to increase home ownership rates because everybody needs to own a home. And so we will have mortgage innovation. Right? So we'll come up with all of these crazed, psychotic mortgage products that are high cost, high risk, and we know how that ended, and it didn't end well. It was one of the reasons we encountered the second worst economic crisis in this country since the recession. We had people that couldn't afford to become homeowners pushed into mortgage products. They couldn't pay them. They defaulted. We had foreclosures, and then the crash. So although housing unaffordability was a problem before the housing crash, and we said it was because of those bad mortgage products, the problem is housing unaffordability remains a problem now. And so you look in cities like Austin, San Francisco, New York, D.C., the working class and poor people still can't find affordable housing. And they can't find housing to buy or to rent. So increasingly, middle income and lower income households are spending up to 50% of the shrinking income that they are receiving just to pay for their housing expenses. And in cities that are seeing urban renewal, gentrification, back to the city movements, that's only making it worse. The reason it's making it worse is because as we have more young, single, high-income workers to move into desirable markets like Austin and D.C. and New York, they're pushing out low-income, middle-income families. They're increasing their housing expenses. And I actually read an article late last night that in San Francisco, even seniors now, so they have stable pensions, stable retirement, they can't find affordable housing to rent. Because Americans can't find affordable housing, poor and middle-income Americans are now taking a second or a third job. they're no longer saving for retirement. And they're increasingly using high-cost forms of financial services like payday loans and credit cards. And I'll talk about payday lending in just a second. Another form of troubling debt is, it hasn't reached the problem yet of the mortgage, subprime mortgage crisis, are subprime automobile loans. Although subprime mortgages, those products have not been as prevalent since the recession, auto loans in the subprime, they're soaring. And it's not surprising that they are, right? Because poor people need to have a car to get to work unless you happen to live in a city that has really great public transit. And so if you're poor, you have low wages, perhaps you don't have the best credit, you find yourself stuck in the subprime auto lending market. And the challenge, of course, is as more people are being pushed out of cities, sort of the places where they live, because of the affordable housing crisis, they have to rely on their cars in order to get to work. And so what we're seeing now over the last, I'd say, 18 months is we're now approaching crisis mode on the subprime automobile side. The loans are defaulting, we're having deficiencies. It's not going to have the same effect when it crashes, and I think it will, but I don't think it's going to have the same effect as the mortgage crash, only because the loans aren't as big. But it will obviously be devastating to the middle income and poor people who need a car to drive to work. One thing that people historically have tried to do to try to close the income gap and sort of improve their lives is to either go to school or to go back to school. In the past, getting more education has worked. It's helped workers to put themselves in a better place in order to move up the economic ladder. The problem with that now, however, is the debt side of college. So parents are increasingly taking on more student loan debt for both their children and for themselves because they're having to go back to school to get job retraining. Young people are drowning in student loan debt, and it's having societal consequences. Millennials aren't getting married, they're not forming their own households, and increasingly they're going back home to live with their parents because they can't even find affordable places to rent. The college issue is a particular challenge with lower income Americans, especially blacks and Latinos, because lower income students and black and Latino students are more likely to attend for-profit colleges. For-profit colleges, their business model is based on receiving student loan revenue. So almost all students that attend these for-profit colleges are financing their education through debt. The problem is many of these colleges provide a worthless education. And so you have students that are borrowing tons of money to go to a for-profit college to try to improve themselves. They end up deeply in debt. The education that they receive, in many instances, the technology that they're using there is antiquated and outdated. Many of them don't graduate or get a certificate or anything. So what happens is they go into debt to go to these programs to try to improve their lives. All they end up with is debt and nothing marketable to help offset the debt that they've incurred. Finally, middle-income households are doing something now that used to be only poor people did. They're going to pawn shops and they're using payday loans. Recent surveys have found that about 30% of college-educated millennials are using pawn shops now. And they're doing it because low income, they have no savings, and they're struggling with their student loan payments. So the economic inequality gaps have created what I characterize as a world of sort of have-nots and have-lots. And it's having a devastating effect on sort of the fabric of the United States. The rich now have essentially fenced themselves away, certainly from the poor, and to some extent from the middle class as well. The rich are sending their children to private schools or to suburban public schools that are economically segregated. So the children of the rich are now growing up in a world where they never have to see the consequences of economic inequality. Economic inequality, and especially income inequality, is now having a profound effect on the high school graduation rates of poor children. So I'll just refer to one study that I recently read. The survey results consistently show that poor children, like middle-income children and high-income children, where they're the sort of third, fourth, fifth, sixth grades, they all want to go to college. They all think they're going to college, they plan to go to college, and their parents want them to go. But as we know, there is a disparate graduation rate between poor children and especially sort of the richest households, children that come from the richest households in this country. Well, what this recent survey found is that income inequality, if there's a big gap between the middle income and the lower income, in those areas, the children that are lower income effectively just give up. They don't graduate from high school, and it is especially true with boys. Now, the study didn't come up with why are they giving up. They speculated perhaps you're looking and you are so far away from even the middle income people that you say, well, a high school degree, it's not going to do me any good because the gap is too big. The problem, of course, is it is virtually impossible to have any sort of upward mobility if you're poor, if you don't have a high school degree. And I would argue we're almost to the point now where you have to have a college degree. So the college degree has now replaced the high school degree as the entry into the middle class. So in my last few minutes, am I done?
Very close.
I have solutions, which we can talk about during the Q&A. Thank you.
You're a model speaker as well as a model colleague. Vasuki, please, you're next.
Thank you. Thanks to Karen and Julia and everyone else who helped with organizing this. I was really happy to be here. So what I want to speak about is, this broader paper that I'm not going to give the whole paper, but broader paper about debt in the particular focus is on looking at debt, gender, and post-conflict development policy. But I want to perhaps take a step back and sort of explain a little bit about what the paper seeks to do and the kind of intervention it seeks to make. Our panel, I think, is titled sort of "Debt and the Production of Inequality," and so I think the paper that I was I'm going to sort of present in some abbreviated version is trying to do two kinds of things. So firstly, it's trying to speak about debt. Debt as governance. There's a lot of discussion now about debt itself as a mode of governance, but I'm particularly interested in sort of what I sort of call sort of nested debt and nested governance. So debt is, in some sense, something that is that you can see at many different levels, from sort of personal debt to sovereign debt, and that these are nested within each other in different sort of schemas of governance. Sometimes they work together, sometimes they work in tension with each other, but largely that work inside, that need to be seen in some sense together, need to be situated together, so that often structural debt engenders high levels of personal debt and vice versa, or it makes so that debt in some sense is everywhere. That it is not a crisis, but it is something that is ordinary, right? So that it is in Balant's words by Alon, sort of a crisis ordinariness that we can see with debt. The particular context in which I look at is in Sri Lanka, which has very high debt. I think Sri Lanka recorded a government debt of 75%, a government debt to government ratio of about 75% of the country's GDP. It's about 40% of government revenues go to paying interest on debts. It's one of the highest in the world. I think it's around the top 15 in the world, and was just very recently once again downgraded by Standard & Poor's and Moody's and so on because of the high level of debt. And the debt engenders it. So for instance, the particular case I look at, once again, is housing. So maybe it was a resonance with Michelle. Look at particularly at debt that's incurred by people in terms of housing. And because, of course, so much of so much of the government's revenues is focused on repaying sovereign debt interest, it means, of course, there's less public financing to enable adequate housing. So that engenders a method of producing housing that forces personal debt, even among the most vulnerable. And here I'm looking particularly at programs that are that deal with in post-conflict zones and post-conflict development agencies. So there's a way in which, so in this and many other ways, debt just engenders more debt. At different kinds of levels, or the people who, Sri Lanka is a very remittance-driven economy. Many of the people who are going out as migrant labor also engender debt to be able to get those employment contracts, and that, of course, is also in some sense because of the reduced impact that sovereign debt has in terms of providing employment. So there's a way. So that's perhaps the first thing I want to say, that I want to look at debt in terms of how these different levels and different scales of debt sort of feed into each other and engender each other. The second thing I want to say is that we're thinking about debt as producing inequality, but I think one of the things I want to look at is debt not just as an economic instrument that exacerbates inequality, but also to draw attention to the affective structure that debt draws on and also engenders. An affective structure that is shaped in a range of different kinds of dialectics, a dialectic between crisis and stability, between despair and promise, between austerity and consumption. It inflects what, in a different context, Adana Sharma calls sort of techno-morality, that shapes both how we think about the debtor and the creditor, or even, the both structurally as well as subjectively. But also, and important, and this is kind of a lot of what I do in the paper, the affective structure is important also in terms of how professional discourse gets mainstreamed into knowledge about how debt works, what kind of the ways in which debt, in here I look particularly as feminist discourse on debt, the way in which debt produces empowerment or produces agency in terms of producing notions of an economic actor in charge of her own housing. There's a whole range of different kinds of ways in which the affective structure of debt is as important in some sense as what the other element of what debt does, which is, of course, the financialization of vulnerability, right? So that those two elements work together, and that we can't focus only on the financialization of vulnerability without also seeing, in some sense, the important layer of debt as promise, as providing, as in terms of this affective dimension. Okay, so that's sort of broadly, in some sense, the interventions I want to situate it in the broader sort of theoretical interventions, and perhaps now I'll sort of go quickly into a summary of the paper itself. So Laurent Ballant argues that one dimension of the cruelty of life under late capitalism is that we get attached to a cluster of promises regarding the good life. Yet these are promises that are generated by and embedded in conditions that are already not working. Thus we get attached to the very conditions that defeat the fulfillment of these promises. And the difficulty of detaching from these compromised conditions of possibility trap us in a prolonged state of crisis, an impasse that naturalizes crisis into our ordinary. This seems a particularly acute characterization of the structural functioning of financial debt for the economically vulnerable. Access to credit seduces with cruel optimism. It provides us consumption in an era of austerity. And while this attachment to living on credit is embedded in conditions of economic dystopia that are both precarious and unsustainable. So Ballant's notion of cruel optimism and crisis ordinariness are particularly helpful in capturing the affective structure of empowerment, in enabling, even easing access to credit precisely for those most financially vulnerable. And here I look particularly at the ways in which feminist knowledge has been produced about the category of empowerment, and looking in particular about the work that feminists have done in a whole range of contexts, and then how it particularly translates into this context in Sri Lanka, of enhancing women's access to credit, enhancing women's access to property title, and encouraging women as entrepreneurs, as economic actors, in the name of empowerment. And that how that then translates into particular policies around housing and debt. So this paper probes the work done by the Promise in post-conflict environments. It focuses particularly on the empowerment programs of international financial institutions and development agencies in the arena of market-oriented post-conflict economic development. In these contexts, interventions that seek to advance empowerment by enhancing women's access to credit, property title, and entrepreneurship have been significant elements of the development policy apparatus. this paper is interested in how particular ideas about the empowerment of women became part of the knowledge apparatus of institutions shaping economic governance in post-conflict environments, and concurrently how these ideas traveled into policies and processes that had far-reaching effects on the ground, although not necessarily effects that were intended or anticipated. This has meant that this chapter looks at the coming together of feminism and international development in projects in advancing women's integration into the private sector in conflict and post-conflict environments. And it does this particularly by looking at empowerment, how it emerges a nodal point for feminist development policy in one large-scale multi-donor development project in Sri Lanka after the end of the war called the Owner-Driven Housing Assistance Program that is interfaced with debt regimes in post-conflict Sri Lanka. So ODHA, this owner-driven housing assistance, is aimed at providing the war-displaced a means to permanent shelter in this post-conflict context and offers a particularly important context to which we can track the work of empowerment discourse and projects of development agencies in post-conflict environments. Am I talking too fast? You guys, yeah, too fast? Okay, fine. So the ODHA has become an interesting window through which to track how feminist insights have become mainstreamed within development policy, with particular reach in conflict and post-conflict environments. So the argument sort of has three parts. So first is about that empowerment discourse had many trajectories, and the particular strand that has had with development agencies and donors over the last 2 decades has been one that converged with neoliberal logics. And in particular, I flag approaches to property, to credit, and entrepreneurship as having converged in feminist discourse of empowerment that can travel under the aura of neoliberal promises. And the second part then looks at how feminism traveled, particularly in the field of conflict and post-conflict. So like an overlapping set in a Venn diagram, knowledge regimes of women's economic empowerment intersect with knowledge regimes about women in conflict and post-conflict in shaping interventions such as ODHA. And finally, the concluding section looks at the distributive and other implications of debt in the context of ODHA. So maybe just for instance, I have a quick description of how ODHA works. So ODHA works as giving people housing grants. Donors give people housing grants for sort of base to build their own houses in the name of empowerment, that instead of the government building houses for you, we'll give you grants. And it came out in some sense, not out of neoliberal programs, but out of grassroots participatory development programs in Latin America after the Peruvian earthquake, a whole range of different kinds of imperatives that shaped it. And that people would then have control. They would become agents. It was part of a participatory development discourse. And here it intersects with sort of languages of the particular policy paradigms of microcredit, also with notions of agency and empowerment. And so people have that base grant, and then they take out debt to enhance, to build better houses, to add an extra room, to do things. So, they've given this, and because of particular knowledges, as I say, of sort of feminist ideas about development and the huge influence they've had in shaping these things, there's a big focus on targeting women for these grants. There's a lot of focus on female-headed households, ideas about giving women access to credit, the importance of giving women title of empowerment. So as a result, a whole range of different strategies have targeted women for these. But of course now, 5 years after the program has thing, there's clear evidence that what the program has engendered is massive indebtedness. So these women coming out of war who were the targets in the name of empowerment end up with huge walking out with huge debts, and that itself then of course has led to, in some sense, the issues around sovereign debt crisis, and it has also led to the fact that banks are now not able to then cover their costs in terms of recover those debts, and has had a whole range of different kinds of implications, sort of financially, but also in terms of other kinds of dimensions of the social structure. So if the original idea of microcredit, they often get the extra debts to top up their housing grants through microcredit schemes, and if the original idea of microcredit schemes was that people were going to address the lack of financial capital with social capital, what this has ended up doing is sort of instrumentalizing social relations in particular ways, so that social relations themselves become commodified because they're embedded into sort of debt structures. So individual property ownership has meant individualized property development costs, and for the vast majority of beneficiaries, the costs have far exceeded the seed grants, and they've taken out loans, both short-term loans to bridge costs while awaiting the next installment of ODHA grant disbursements, or long-term goals to cover out the overall shortfall in building costs. So the broader argument here is that the policies advanced by the post-conflict development apparatus can themselves exacerbate economic vulnerability in post-conflict environments, and through this particular this sort of the double work in some sense that is both affective as well as financial, that does this work of sort of commodifying the vulnerability of particular kinds of groups, but then also financializing ideas of empowerment in particular ways, because increasingly even microcredit has become commercialized. There have been for-profit enterprises, I mean, internationally, but certainly there's been a huge push in Sri Lanka as well, which earlier had a very vibrant corporate sector, to cooperatives movement, to focus instead on for-profit environments, for-profit banking industries. The Sri Lanka sovereign debt is now, as I mentioned earlier, over 75% of its GDP, and debt overwhelms the everyday lives of those post-war communities as they navigate the crisis ordinaries of post-conflict economic governance. And from household debt to sovereign debt, debt is not a backup option when routine budgets fall short. Rather, debt itself becomes a way of routinized into budgeting. And so that's, in some sense, I guess maybe where I should end, that Sri Lanka, the ordinariness of debt, that it's no longer something that is that's something that people have to depend on in context of crisis or context where there is a financial shortfall, but that it becomes something that's that it is now, of course, everywhere, from Sri Lanka to Detroit to Athens, something that's ordinary. This paper sought, in some sense, to analyze the role of the way in which particular notions of feminist knowledge about empowerment in the infrastructure becomes incorporated into the infrastructure of crisis ordinariness in environments undergoing post-war economic reconstruction, and concomitantly to probe the politics of female empowerment as it gets mobilized in this context. And given this channeling of many feminisms to neoliberal economic policy led to debt, dispossession, and socioeconomic precarity, we need to understand how feminism came to define empowerment in these terms, and that these are elements of what we may see as something of a sort of a long-term research agenda, sort of looking at feminist political morality that rhymes with sort of neoliberal agendas, and in particular inclusion, agency, and commitment as elements of the affective glue tethering international conflict feminism to neoliberalism, and the promise of inclusion into the market, agency as market actors, and a commitment to redemptive citizenship in a post-conflict landscape. The neoliberal logics tied to property, credit, and entrepreneurship traveled under the aura of empowerment. In Undoing the Demos, Wendy Brown has recently argued that the power of neoliberalism is best understood not as economic policies for exploitation and profit, but as sort of termite-like political rationality that renders us all as entrepreneurs. There's an important resonance here with the path that empowerment discourse has traveled, where market logics have integrated with discourses and strategies that articulated dissidence and heterodoxy. The purveyors of economic governance invested in a vision of empowerment and assimilated its ways of knowing and shaping the world. The goals, assumptions, and methodologies that attend this techno-morality has become part of the institutional and symbolic machinery of cruel optimism. And that central to the economy of desire here is its mutuality, that empowerment and neoliberal development marry agendas and visions through richer and poorer, including richer promises and poorer futures. So.
Thank you very much. All right. Owen.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. It's beautiful to be in such a warm, sunny place instead of rain and cold and rainy London. You'll see my talk is on structural inequality, international law, and the global economy, and that there isn't any human rights in that title. And that's not really by accident. So I was struck by the contest panel, the second panel we had yesterday, and the way that rights kind of disappeared from the discussion as soon as we began to talk about seriously challenging the global economic system. And so in essence, that encaptures my position. So I want to present a talk in which inequality is seen as systematically generated. Human rights is not capable of addressing the systematic generation of international inequality. And that this isn't just about power in the international system, but about which elements of law really have teeth and enforce themselves powerfully and swiftly through the international system. And that this relates deeply to the nature of law, really, and the essence of rights discourse. So my background lies in analysing the form of law and how open it is or otherwise to revolutionary politics. So that is like kind of radical redistributive efforts. And so that informs my skepticism. The basic frame for my presentation is that law is about the abstract balancing of rights, in essence. And my position is that there is a tendency within law to favour this abstract balancing in the direction of the preservation of property and the sanctity of contract. So in the context of vast and growing inequality, the law in this light would have a tendency to lock in and exacerbate that inequality. Human rights discourse, in theory, offers something that you might be able to hold up against the operation of this system. Perhaps the sanctity of personal life and space, particularly social rights and perhaps environmental rights to some extent. But the general context of the global economy through sovereign debt, foreign direct investment, and the development of investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms is to shift this balance even more in favour of existing property and contract, thus further exacerbating inequality and rendering those human rights legal protections toothless, which I think is what we currently see on the international scale. Now, what this means is, as always, law isn't a tool you should use advisedly. You can't avoid it. As a good friend of mine, Rob Knox, once said, if you don't do the law does you. So you can't avoid doing it, but it's worth looking very carefully at what the negative consequences are or might be of engaging in human rights activism, of using the language of human rights. And then we'll be left with the open question, which I'm not going to be able to answer now or perhaps ever, of where else or how else you might conduct that struggle. So that's the basic frame. I'd also like to open with two cautions that motivate my intervention. Firstly, I think it's really important not to conflate the appearance of law with the muscle of law. And this should run through the heart of my presentation. I feel that human rights and these kind of interventions have the appearance of law, but they do not have the force of law that we find in international economic relations, and particularly debtor-creditor relations. And so I want to kind of pick out where that force comes from. And a second caution comes from reading some reflections by Arundhati Roy recently, talking about her concern over the language of human rights. And she's concerned because the concept of human rights, and I'm quoting here, has replaced the much grander idea of justice. Human rights are fundamental rights. They are the minimum, the very least we should demand. Too often they become the goal itself. What should become the minimum becomes the maximum, all we are supposed to expect. And I have a feeling here that she's speaking about the way in which, especially in dark times, the positive sheen on human rights can colonize our minds and our imagination and sets new limits to what we think we can achieve politically. And there's another element here which Roy also talked about, which is that in bad times, criticizing human rights, in times basically when austerity politics and austerity economics mean you're not even getting the bare minimum that human rights might offer you. Criticizing these from a completely different point of view as being insufficient or a misdirection suddenly looks rather terrible. So to liberals, you'll begin to look like the real bad guys. So that's what it might look like on this panel to liberals. There are a couple of background assumptions that rest behind my presentation, so I'll just run through those really quickly before I begin to talk a little bit about investor-state dispute settlement slightly and a few cases of sovereign debt and default. The first is about the nature of the global political economy. So for me, what kind of informs this discussion is that one of the most fundamental aspects of the contemporary global economy is the free flow of international capital, coupled with the formation of complex and shifting global production chains. In many ways, these developments can be seen to undermine the provision and protection of human rights by the state. This occurs as the state seeks to attract foreign direct investment or retain international capital, and in doing so begins to favour the interests of international capital over other domestic constituencies, thus exacerbating the ways in which the state might already serve particular interests. This is currently taking a powerful turn under neoliberal economic doctrine and austerity politics. So this is not particularly new. Any student of early dependency theorists in the 60s and 70s will be familiar with this story. And I think, interestingly, there can be a very plausible argument made that many developed states now contain elements of the old underdevelopment thesis. They're facing the same kind of pressures and the same possible development of a comprador class. I think we can definitely see this in the UK at the moment. The second assumption I hold is a sort of legal theory one. And firstly, this is, as I said, that the law is, in some essential form, always about the clash of rights claims. And the classic Marxist critique of this, taken actually by China Mieville in a kind of provocative direction, using Marx's quote, "between equal rights, forced asides," which does open itself up to the classic accusation of collapsing law into politics, without being clear enough about what force exactly is in this context. And so to talk about sovereign debt and wealth, I think it's important to open up the idea of force here, to align this more closely with a concept of money, seen as an exercise of power over life, and particularly over labour. Combination of that with law, thinking about debt and contract under structural duress, and eventually the force of arms when these conditions are challenged. So force becomes, in the classic conception of force, is only one element of a complex nexus of the way in which our lives are governed by capital. There's another nice quote, not to overly quote Marx, but of how rights are particular under capitalism. This is one that speaks to my heart. Originally, the rights of property seemed to us to be grounded in man's own labour. Now, however, property turns out to be the right on the part of the capitalist to appropriate the unpaid labour of others or its product, and the impossibility of the worker of appropriating his own product. The separation of property from labour thus becomes the necessary consequence of a law that apparently originated in their identity. Against this, progressives, and particularly human rights scholars, but I think it goes far beyond this subdiscipline, see great hope in the usage or the potential subversion of rights discourse. Subversion if we can accept that the law plays a historically conservative social role. And here I'm thinking of David Renton, who made an argument in The Socialist Lawyer that against this inalienable right of the property owner to do as they wished, we could postulate that there's no reason in principle why there should not be an equally overriding principle of social responsibility. I think this has some weight, and it took me a long time to wrestle with that in my thesis, and I'm not going to go into it right now, as for how I think law doesn't actually contain that open possibility. But it is something that's worth thinking about quite deeply. On this assumption, human rights should be open to potential empowerment within legal discourse to trump other considerations. And my argument would be that we should be very cautious of this. For practical reasons, I don't see it working now. For historical reasons, I don't see it having worked in the past. And for theoretical reasons. And for me, that seems very feasible to read law as inherently biased towards conservative property rights. And the Soviet jurist Eugene Pashakanis very beautifully termed this the gravity of law, the central point around which it always returns, no matter how much you as a jurist might attempt to push it in the direction of protecting social rights. So, background assumptions out of the way. Thinking about all of this led me to look in general at how the force of legal argument combines with the force of law, sanctions, and in the economic relation, before and over other areas, which leads you internationally to the focus on finance and money, reading money as power in the international system. In light of this, sovereign debt becomes hugely important and does have a clear link to human rights, which actually came up in the discussion yesterday. Both panels, actually, talking about the Greek government, which was taken to the European Committee of Social Rights by Greek pension funds, claiming a violation of their social rights. Now, its defence, which I think Tony Angie mentioned yesterday, Greece claimed that the modifications of the pensioners' social protection result from the government's other international obligations, namely those deriving from the financial support mechanism agreed upon by the government, together with the European Commission, the European Bank, and the International Monetary Fund, collectively the Troika, in 2010. Now, the ECSR rejected this argument, but for myself, I think it's important to note two things. First, that Greece is highlighting here a balance of rights, in which one right, that external right of investors, won by default. This also there would have been serious consequences for non-compliance in this area, against which the European Court could dismiss the argument, but only in doing so to lay further blame at the door of a country that was effectively being, thanks so much, looted and lacked the capacity to protect those rights. So I see this as really a loss for a human rights approach on both theoretical and practical grounds in that instance. We had lots of discussions yesterday about how the Greek government was effectively, in this point of time, under the direct control of their debtors. Now, Margot Salomon, whose work on this I think is very interesting and very indicative, describes this situation, saying there's been a half-century of standard setting in the area of socio-economic rights, regionally and internationally, enhanced by the normative development of their content. Why was all this accumulated knowledge and experience ignored? The people of Greece were treated as if there is no history. Now, I would argue that the people of Greece were treated exactly as a student of history would expect, especially a student of sovereign debt, basically. So I'm going to very briefly look at a little bit of those historical examples. We'll probably run out of time in doing so. So one thing I wanted to talk a little bit about is the Roosevelt corollary, which was basically the corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which asserted the U.S. right to support debt repayments in Latin America. This came about following the blockade by Britain, Germany, and Italy, naval blockade of Venezuela, in order to force the repayment of Venezuelan debt. And following this, there was the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague favoured the debt claims of the blockaders. Now, clearly, this generated concern with the US about both European influence in the region and also, particularly, about the subordination of American debts to European repayments. Now, the Corporation of Foreign Bondholders, which is a very interesting organisation, worth looking at the history of, attributed rising bond prices subsequent to the Roosevelt corollary to these actions, believing that default obligations would be prevented by American power. Mechele and Wertheimer both found that, in their economic analysis, the average sovereign debt price for countries under the US sphere of influence at this point in time rose by 74%. In terms of actual US intervention, they didn't need to do much beyond the example that they made of Santo Domingo. And so you can look at Cyrus Vesse's piece, a book called A World Safe for Capitalism, on this, in the way in which this served as an example for other potential defaulters in Latin America at the time. One thing I did want to highlight in talking about sovereign debt here is the ability to create default in some areas and prevent it in others, which is the prerogative of a powerful state at the center of an international financial system. And here, the debt defaults of the southern US states, which ran between 1840 and 1870, in which 15 different US states were in default, was sort of enabled and empowered by the US federal government and their avoidance of general arbitration treaties at the time. I have to be brief here for conditions of time. And here, again, the Corporation of Foreign Bondholders, based in London, laments that the US government seems to vary its attitude according to whether a dispute lies between its own nationals and a foreign state, or between foreign nationals and its own states. It is alone in the world to adhere to, in theory and practice, to the amazing thesis that its own subsidiary sovereign states can find sanctuary from just debts behind a national aegis. I think we can see, and I'll have to be very brief here again, this contemporary function continuing in the case of Greece and very importantly also Argentina, which only very recently came to an end with the vulture funds, which bought up sovereign debt, Argentinian sovereign debt, very, very cheaply. Recently, having been awarded, two hedge funds have come to a settlement in New York courts. Both Bracebridge Capital awarded $950 million, which they brought at 10 cents on the dollar back in 2002, and NML Capital awarded $2.28 billion on a principal of $617 million, which they brought at around 5 cents on the dollar. I would like to talk a little bit about investor-state dispute settlement, but I have run out of time. So basically, just as a quick summary, my position is that international investment law is arguably one of the most immediate and powerfully enforced areas of international law at present, even compared to other areas of international economic law like WTO disputes, which you might see as having more bite, let alone even mentioning any human rights norms. And I would argue that this isn't a coincidence that some areas of law rely on moral force and others do not. Thank you.
Well, Raj, you have a rich banquet in front of you. Have at it.
Mike, in fact, this is too much to digest. So I'm going to just nibble. And with those eating metaphors behind me, I want to first of all, thank the organisers for bringing us together, and the panellists for three really exciting papers. I mean, Mechele, the idea of understanding the new particular force that's being felt by the eviscerated middle class, and the articulations between class formations and the implication of the debt complex, I think is incredibly interesting. Vasuki, thank you so much for bringing together the ideas of the idea of the entrepreneurial poor and the way in which gender feeds into that, particularly in post-conflict reconstruction. And thank you, Owen, for essentially channeling everything I wanted to say about the difficulties of expecting much of human rights law and of the Universal Declaration when we live under capitalism. And I'm also grateful, Jay, for your wonderful timekeeping. I'm grateful for the money that made this room possible. I'm for the life that's on the walls. I'm grateful for the workers who worked for the people who then have their names on this building. I'm grateful for the people who looked after the children of the people who worked so that we could have such rich endowments at this university. I'm grateful for the people who once lived on this land, who were exterminated in the founding of these great states. I'm grateful for the Comanche, and I'm grateful for the people that they displaced before the creation of the United States. And all of a sudden you see that I'm going to stop that. But you get, I mean, the point here, obviously, is that debt is a way of structuring memory. Debt is a way of understanding the past through law, through a very specific prism of law, so that certain things get remembered and accounted and are eligible for the use of force, and others are not. Reproductive labour and the exploitation of reproductive labour is not usually the sort of thing that you can expropriate on the grounds of, whereas property rights are precisely the sort of thing that you can ask the police to enforce. That idea that the arrangement of memory matters isn't just an academic point. It's something that matters, even as we see in the story of Greece. I was having a very interesting conversation with Jamie Galbraith about what he and Yanis were trying to do when they were making the kinds of arguments they were making about the debt crisis and about austerity. Because every economist worth a damn, and there aren't that many, but every economist was pointing out that every shred of evidence, every force of logic was pointing to the unsustainability of the Troika's plan. Even the IMF, and again, you don't have to think very hard about the IMF to understand that the IMF itself was saying that the terms that were being pushed on Greece by the Troika were unsustainable, particularly by Germany. But you can't use logic when it comes to these kinds of arguments. You had to, and what was interesting, I think, is that in the appeals to human rights, one could be saying, well, the human rights of Greek pensioners were being violated, but the owners of the debt can point to Article 17 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and say, well, no, that they have a human right, surely, not to be expropriated of their property. And again, as Owen was saying, the Marx quote that matters here is between equal rights, force decides. But that's interesting. I mean, I think that it's interesting that the strategy that was being used in Greece was one about an appeal to something that was extra-legal, an appeal to fairness. Because, and I want to just explore that for a second. The idea of that's not fair. I mean, when you hear that's not fair in a playground, you see these two kids and one has snatched the toy of another, and you can figure out what to do there. Well, that's not. You just snatched that toy. Give it back. But what if someone says, well, that's not fair, I want reparations for slavery? Did you say, well, no, I'm sorry, you're a bit late. You should have said that at the time. Or, I mean, is there some sort of statute of limitation? How far back do you go before you can cut off the idea of that's not fair? And I think an interesting place to look, an interesting place to begin this sort of deliberation is at the beginning of modern capital. Modern capitalism, which, I mean, we can, I mean, there wasn't a grand ceremony, there wasn't a ribbon cutting for the beginning of capitalism. But we can see many of the forces that we identify today as the sort of central forces in capitalism emerging in the 1450s, especially through moments of colonial contact, through the production of sugar, through the colonization specifically of Madeira by the Portuguese, through slavery, and through the management of credit and debt, specifically involving a bank called the Ufficio San Giorgio, the Bank of St. George. Quick show, has anyone heard of the Bank of St. George? Okay, you should know about that bank. Exciting bank. It was the bank through which 2/3 of all silver from the New World flowed down through the spice route. It was an incredibly important bank at the time. It was the sort of bank of which Machiavelli said, this establishment presents an instance of what in all the republics has never been thought of, existing within the same community, among the same citizens, liberty and tyranny. And should it happen, as in time it may, that the San Giorgio should have possession of the whole city of Florence, the republic will become more distinguished than that of Venice. So this was a bank that controlled Corsica. It controlled a number of possessions, colonies in the Black Sea. It had a militia. It employed people like Christopher Columbus as sugar traders. It allegedly had the Ark of the Covenant, from Indiana Jones et al. It had that in its vault. It was an incredibly powerful institution. It was involved in the issuing of sovereign debt. And it was also in the business of slavery. And I think we should just very quickly, a number of the papers sort of touched on this, but I think it's important just to sort of flag the difference between national debt and personal debt. National debt, when you're heavily in debt, the most indebted nations are also the most powerful. When you think about the United States, for example, or Brazil or India, to be able to command the printing of money, seigniorage, and powerful seigniorage is, as we see in Europe, as we see in the United States, where a country this large is able to mobilize debt in ways where certain private sector actors and the state can work together to be able to actually be incredibly powerful forces globally. And on the other hand, individual debt is precisely how it is that bodies are disciplined through right from the very beginning of capitalism. In fact, bodies are initially, of course, when we think of slaves, bodies are themselves instruments of debt. People have seen 12 Years a Slave. You remember that bit where Solomon Northrop is lent to his neighbor because the slave owner is himself in debt and he needs to repay the debt by giving this debt instrument to his neighbor. Slavery worked by actually having bodies as mechanisms for the transmission and carrying of debt. So I just want to flag that as a tension that's sort of come up and that we should probably discuss in questions. But I want to suggest that while we understand debt and memory, we see many of the themes that we're talking about in this panel and through this conference emerging at the start of capitalism. Obviously, we're living in what people optimistically called late capitalism now. And neoliberalism has with particular force meant the normalization of debt. Right? We obviously need to go into debt in order to pay for things that used to be state-provided services, whether that's education or whether we imagine that there might be pensions waiting for us at some point in the future. The idea of debt becomes normal under neoliberalism. And so what I want to do, Mechele, actually, is kind of get to the bit of the discussion where we think about what these solutions might be. At some level, it seems fairly straightforward. Debt forgiveness, a jubilee, and an idea of the restitution of state-provided services so people don't need to go into debt for things like education or healthcare or to have a decent public transportation system so privatized transport isn't the sort of thing that then gets people over a barrel. The idea of actually having full and vast and equitable social services is a great way of blunting the edge of what we understand to be the debt complex at the moment. A living wage, a basic income grant is a way of avoiding debt. There was a nice piece in The Guardian today as a result of the the Panama Papers, suggesting that actually the Panama Papers show that a living wage, a basic income grant in the United States is entirely possible if only we tax the rich. Now, I think that's an interesting argument, and we can have that. But there's still one more part of this discussion I think would be fun to have, which is, look, imagine that we solve the acute reasons under neoliberalism why people go into debt. Do we not have debt anymore? What about the future? Is it all of a sudden that we don't need debt and we don't need credit? Well, I think actually, no, we probably do. I mean, the movements like La Via Campesina was mentioned yesterday as a group that is very savvy to the idea of human rights and using them when you can and ignoring them when they turn out to be flimsy. Members of La Via Campesina also want credit. And there are lots of groups around the world that think that credit is a good idea. But surely what matters is the teeth, as Owen was saying. What matters is who is it that is in charge of enforcing debt regulation and debt repayment, and under what terms can debt be forgiven? I think that's ultimately the question, isn't it? Under what conditions can debt be forgiven? And I think part of having this conversation involves a conversation about reparations. Right? I mean, if we are interested in moving to a world where we can have the kinds of social services where we can entertain a decent conversation about the alternative to capitalist credit, we need to have funds to do that. And a conversation about reparations is a good way to start. But I also think that there are movements and there are precedents around what it is that a good system of credit looks like that isn't a capitalist one. And for that, we can look again to older texts that don't use human rights to ask what's fair. So in the Bible, for example, the thing that you swear on when you're in this courtroom conducting your normal business, there is the idea of the Jubilee, an event that happens every 7 years in which debts are forgiven. And it seems to me that that's not a bad idea, that there are some social norms that transcend the force of the state and that are widely accepted by a community in order that people's debt can be exculpated, that debt can be forgiven. And I kind of like that idea. The reason I like that idea is because, first of all, it recognizes that, yes, we need credit. We need credit for investment. People need to borrow in order to be able to fulfill their ambitions, to be meaningfully free in a society where there are market exchanges. But those market exchanges don't have to be capitalist, and the way that credit is distributed doesn't need to be through the force of banks as we currently understand them. And, credit cooperatives offer an alternative to that. But I think the point that I'd like to leave with is the idea that in order for all of these conversations to be entertained, we do need a process of reparations first. Reparations for capitalism, reparations for the disasters that have been caused underneath it, but also so that those reparations can provide this bolus of funds for the imagining of a post-capitalist economy. That, of course, is a revolutionary thought, and that's one that I'll leave you with now. Thank you.
Well, that's an even richer banquet now, thanks to you. And so we're going to throw it open. I understand that I have the chair's prerogative to throw out a first question, if I may. Not nearly as well informed as our panelists. But it seems to me that in the 19th century and a good part of the 20th century, there was much more discussion of economic rights. And not just human rights in sort of the traditional Bill of Rights, Declaration of Rights sort of sense. And that sort of conversation seems to have largely disappeared from the discourse with which I'm familiar. So that's my general question. My specific question is, in some countries now, it is actually possible to render a debt unenforceable if the loan was made at a time when the debtor, as a matter of retail credit reports or whatever, had more than a certain amount of debt in ratio to that debtor's income. In other words, it would simply punish irresponsible lending or hopefully deter irresponsible lending. Now, that's a very specific, sort of, one might say, nitty-gritty sort of question. So I throw out one of each and invite comments.
From us?
Of course.
Okay. So I'll do the second part, the nitty-gritty part. And It also ties somewhat into sort of the last point that Raj threw out about reparations and sort of what would a fair credit system look like. And so in addition to the fact that I think you should look at how much debt the person already has before you, for example, let them buy a home. So it's a little bit harder now for people to get these horribly toxic mortgage loans that went quickly into foreclosure because of certain rules that were put in place after the recession. But also, I think we have to look at interest. So when we're looking at what's fair in terms of a credit system or a debt system, at some point we have to say that the interest that you pay on payday loans is, at some point, too much interest is whether we say it's unconscionable, it's unfair, or it should be a crime. It used to be a crime. It used to be illegal in a lot of states. And then we've now decided that, we need to have sort of credit and, all credit is good, free flow of credit and trickle down and yada, 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 everything will be better. But I think if we're talking about sort of what's a fair credit system, we have to both look at how much debt should a human being be allowed to go into before we just say, no, if you want a loan to that person, that's fine, but you can't collect that debt. And then second, how much are we going to allow creditors to benefit from the debt in the form of interest?
Other comments from our panel?
Yeah, I guess where I think is most useful is to look at how different things get incentivized, whether it is in terms of being a bad creditor or being a bad debtor, or being a good one, and that the different kinds of logics that are generated by the system in some sense, in terms of ideas of discipline and ideas of empowerment or ideas of austerity, and the ways in which, in particular, I think citizenship has been reshaped into a focus on privatized consumption and personal responsibility and so on. And so I don't know whether it is precisely addressing questions about solutions, but it's about the importance of tracking those things. I think tracking how different kinds of whether it's public morality or so on get mapped onto financial instruments, and seeing those linkages as being intertwined. Yeah.
Indeed. Other comments?
I would just add, maybe briefly on that point, I know that with when the Conservative government came to power in the UK, they relaxed rules on payday borrowing. And again, you suddenly saw companies like Wonga, which is a payday loan, advertising loans on TV for thousands of % APR. And presumably only the very, very, very most desperate of people would ever be using that system. In terms of a discussion of economic rights, that actually reminds me of a discussion, again, we had a little bit yesterday on the new international economic order from the 60s and 70s, the Third World Movement. They talked about economic rights a lot and attempted to have, in international law, a proper discussion of the use of economic force in international law to force states to do what you want. But unfortunately, that is the very basis of international capitalism. As many commentators at the time realized, if that's the fundamental nature of competitive economic business, then you can't prevent economic force being used in that way in the international system. And for me, I guess partly the problem there would be using the language of rights and hoping it would address the system rather than tackling the system head on. Yeah.
Okay. Do you have a comment? No. So, comments and questions are very welcome. Yes, over here.
This question is for Owen. Owen, I really liked your paper, and I completely agree that the Roosevelt corollary was really important in sort of producing this deterrence for default. But I wonder if also the assassination of Thomas Sankara in the 1980s sort of played a big role in this in kind of the modern era, because he gave that really famous speech against debt in the mid-1980s, right? And then immediately afterwards was assassinated in a French-backed coup. And it seems to me that maybe that was kind of like an important object lesson for the rest of the continent, at least. If you default on your debt, or even if you say you will, there's this credible threat of violence and deposition.
Other comments and questions? Just right straight forward here. Yes, sir.
Thanks very much for a fascinating way to start the morning. As many have said, for those that are indebted, debt is a kind of the miracle of compound interest in reverse, especially when accompanied with real wage declines. My question was about this relationship between sovereign debt and personal debt, notwithstanding the very big differences. There have been many in the U.S. and other places that have tried to use those conditions which define illegitimate debt, which were developed in the 70s and 80s and 90s, more recently in the Guiding Principles on Debt and Human Rights, around sovereign debt, to try and set out conditions for alleviating personal debt. Occupy, for example, created a working group on student debt when they tried to distinguish particular conditions and situations where debt was illegitimate and should therefore be relieved in some way. I'm wondering what you all think about this corollary and to what degree personal debt or personal debtors could use this logic of illegitimate debt to seek relief.
Comments?
Oh, I thought you were going to. I think the student loan example is a great example, and especially for the, some would argue that the Corinthian colleges, which is now fortunately bankrupt and out of business, ended up that way because we looked at the debt that students went into at the for-profit colleges that composed, that Corinthian College was sort of an umbrella organization. And the students received absolutely nothing in return for the debt that they got when they went to those colleges. So I think that a lot of people, when the students said, I'll default, what are you going to do to me? You can't collect the money from me. And we had a lot of students in the country from the Corinthian colleges that said, we're going to band together, we're going to be public, we're going to make a big to-do out of it. And it caused some members of Congress to sort of shift their views about, do we really want to help Corinthian colleges when they caused so much harm to poor people, poor students, and students of color. When they went there, they tried to better themselves, and all they got was debt and nothing marketable. So I think there is at least it worked pretty well, I think, in the context of Corinthian colleges with the student loan debt.
I think that there's definitely something there. I'm in a room full of lawyers, so I'm not going to. I know that there's someone who knows the answer, knows the precise status of the law on debt forgiveness and the illegitimate debt incurred through educational loans. I would be mortified if what happened at an international level was also being applied to individuals. I mean, at an international level, the way that debt forgiveness worked was that the country had to restructure to become a fully neoliberal place before the debt could be forgiven. We don't want that happening on an individual level. But I also think that there are ways that you can use the student debt moment also to actually do interesting constructive things. There's a program in New York called the New York State Loan Forgiveness Program where instead of repaying debt, the student loan is forgiven if people sink equity into becoming farmers, for example. And so it ends up being that the loan repayment is a down payment on land. Unfortunately, only 12 people are eligible every year, so it's not a huge program. But it is interesting because the idea is that even if debt's forgiven, you're still living in an awful place, and you're still living without assets or equity. And all of a sudden, this is a trial program to actually be able to figure out, well, what do you do to flip that? And I think that's a very interesting moment to try and sort of rewrite that script. But there's 12 is just not quite enough.
Yeah, I think many of the efforts around personal debt forgiveness that come out of the policy efforts have been very much like sovereign debt restructuring in terms of having its own disciplinary, very explicit disciplinary conditionalities under which people get qualify and under which people have to work towards. I think maybe your Occupy thing was interesting because I think many of the most interesting things is when people have actually there was this, I think maybe 2 days ago there was a Chilean young man who had burnt all the student loan contracts, and which now make it very difficult to enforce. The Guardian had a piece on that. And many of the, I think even Corinthian, there was an effort, I think, to get sort of 1 million students to agree to not to default, and they couldn't get 1 million. In the end, 1 million did default, just not as a social movement, but because they couldn't pay back their loan. So I think, yeah. So I mean, I think in some sense, resistance is, when one has to separate resistance from debt forgiveness as a policy, because debt forgiveness as a policy is inevitably has frequently been also embedded into the same logics that has produced the debt in the first place, because people are making, banks or whatever, or governments are making a call that it's in their interest to restructure the debt in ways that sort of engender their own long-term financial health, rather than ones that are going to challenge the system in some fundamental way. So.
Yeah, further to that, I mean, in the UK, I know the government were offering small amounts of forgiveness on student loans if you moved into areas of primary school or secondary school teaching that they were particularly in need of, so maths and hard sciences. So you could use it as from the official level, it's used as a way of trying to direct labour into areas where you want labour to be. In terms of the general student loan book as a whole, I mean, the Conservative government were looking to sell it at one point. I think it's 40 billion as a state asset. And in the small print of all student loans in the UK are the government's basically reserving the right to change the terms of the loan at any point in the future. And so part of selling on the loan book and its profitability as an asset to buy would turn on the possibility of changing those terms and extracting more. And I think that might hit, there would be a collective action problem, but in terms of mass non-repayment of student loans in that condition, I can imagine that being relatively effective, just in terms of not having the state there to enforce it, perhaps, in any way, and there being too many people. And yeah, just in reference to people being assassinated over talking about debt and repayment claims, yeah, I agree with you 100%, especially I think a lot of Aristide's ousting had a lot to do with challenging France too much over similar things. I mean, just on a very brief level, I didn't get to talk about odious debt doctrine, but that, having worked in very few cases under US occupation, so in Iraq and in Cuba, actually after the Spanish-American War, they claimed that Cuban loans through Spain were incurred in order to suppress the Cuban population, and that America wasn't going to accept liability for them after occupying the country. That tells you something about the fate of odious debt doctrine, but that's something I'm hoping to look into more in the future.
Microphone in hand.
I'm just really curious to hear some of the promised things at the end of Mechele's talk. In particular, I'm curious whether when debt is a helpful category for us to use in thinking about these things as opposed to some of the other categories like poverty, exclusion, racial domination, when debt is the helpful category and when maybe these others.
Well, I guess I see them as related, especially when we think in terms of race. And so I've used the example of for-profit colleges, because blacks and Latinos are much more likely to attend those colleges because they are marketed more in low-income and black and Latino neighborhoods. Likewise, during the housing crisis, subprime loans were disproportionately pushed in neighborhoods that were black and Latino. And when we look now at gentrification, we never have neighborhoods that are gentrified from white to black or brown. It's always the other way around. So, when I think in terms of debt, there's always a racial component to it. So I guess I don't quite see them as separate.
Yes.
I have a couple of comments and a couple of questions. One thing that the Occupy movement has been doing is buying debt at cheaper rates and forgiving them. And so I think that's something to remember, that there is this social movement that's trying to deal with issues of debt. And so one question is, the amount of debt is actually not real, right? Because they get to sell it at much cheaper rates to others. And the fact that the Occupy movement was able to go in there and buy them for a good reason rather than another reason. And globally, a lot of the debt is being bought at very cheap rates, not the amount that was actually given. And the last thing is, I think in terms of debt, we really need to think about the role of credit rating agencies that are not governed, that work for the people who give the debts, and a country's ability to deal with their debt is completely on what rating they get from the credit rating agencies that can just completely escalate their debt. And so I think we really need to think about the governance of credit rating agencies as these entities that don't, I mean, they're all American, and they get to decide what country and how much they're going to owe based on how they rate them. And so I think we can't talk about debt without talking about credit rating agencies.
Yes, back in it. Yes, back there, please.
I want to just re-ask, Jay, your last question on the nitty-gritty details. So the question is, has Bernie Sanders made Liz Warren irrelevant? Would be one way to put it. And it's been the move to social movements, to resistance, to human rights, to history, is a move for an alternative vernacular of contestation that would somehow push back against the whole framework within which debt, let's say, is structured from a different angle. But it's always struck me that the law regulating things like debt and property is, in fact, filled with all kinds of qualifying conditions and details that maybe don't get used, maybe we've lost interest in them, or I'm not sure what exactly. But, I mean, it always struck me in the credit default swaps at the moment of the crisis, there were lots of good legal arguments why they weren't enforceable, from classic contract and property law, why those weren't pushed by the people who were on the hook, I always wondered about. Now, and so I just want to say, is it really right, Owen, that forget it, everything interior to law is misbalanced, and so we need to move to these alternate rhetorics, or there are inside these legal doctrinal specialties and histories things that could be pushed in a much more radical way than they're being pushed now, and wouldn't we want to figure that out?
Okay, just to respond to that then. For me, that often turns on a political question, two aspects to this, really. Firstly, who you need to convince. So that path means you need to go and speak to lawyers and judges and arbitrators and try and get them to think like you in order to rule in your favor. Because, yes, from a legal theory perspective, I'm definitely of the opinion that the law is indeterminate. And so looking through some WTO case laws that I was working on recently, we had the appellate body report. I can't remember the name of the case, unfortunately, correcting the initial panel report, because the initial panel report discussing it was whether or not Japanese shochu was the same as vodka, a like product. The panel had mistakenly said it's arbitrary whether or not we see products as like. And the review body had said, no, this is a discretionary process. And for me, this is true. Like, at the heart of legal reasoning, there's an arbitrary point at which the arbitrator is going to make a decision. And they'll either do so unanimously or however the structure of the system. And you can tinker with that. You can try and play and get the courts to reflect your decisions. But I just don't see it as a particularly effective or likely. I think the chances of success are too small on that front. Yeah.
Yes, sir. Microphone's coming.
I just want to tell you how rich the metaphor is of this Jubilee, except the Jubilee was the really big shakeup every 50 years. The sabbatical was every 7 years. And if you don't get that straight, then you're going to lose out on your sabbaticals. You get them every 7 years. But if you remember in the Old Testament that the Joseph, who has been himself sold into slavery, goes over to Egypt and he impresses Pharaoh because he could interpret dreams. and he knew that this famine was coming. And he works with Pharaoh when people are coming in to get the food. He says, well, you know, if they get the food, then we get their land. And then 400 years later, you have this slave revolt. It was a debtors' revolt. And it was that's the formation, that revolution is the formation of modern Judaism, and it's also the formation, I think, of our basic values in civilization. We don't take this stuff. And then this sabbatical and the Jubilee, that's the offshoot. That's how this new society is supposed to be organized.
There certainly have been a lot of revolutions that have been begun by debtors, that's for sure. Other comments or questions? Yes, sir.
Right. So I want to pick up on something that David mentioned and something that I think has come up on the panel. And so when I hear presentations like yours, Owen, I'm always driven to a kind of more generalized pessimism than just pessimism about human rights. Right? I mean, it's, you know, the coup in Chile in 1973 was about debt. It wasn't a legal event. It was, you know, it was a power event, and so was the blockade of Venezuela, and so is assassinating people who talk about debt, and so on. And so, you know, it's not just law that has a center of gravity that revolves around property and wealth, right? It's power and politics and everything else, right? And one of the things that I think you can think about is whether spaces like bankruptcy law or like human rights law or like the discussion around student debt are spaces where you can contest that a little bit, right? And even Raj's invocation of a more robust welfare state, which provides us, you know, reasonable forms of debt and reasonable forms of public services and so on, those strike me as being sort of within that, the overall paradigm in which property still is important, and we still marketize transactions, and we still do a bunch of things that are within that overall paradigm. And so, so I wonder if the general pessimism about power and law and how power operates in the world and how much it's anchored in property, if that general pessimism shouldn't push us, rather than up toward let's throw the whole thing over, whether that shouldn't push us down into finding particular sites where we can contest that general trend, and whether one of those sites can't be human rights or bankruptcy law or particular pieces of property law, particular kinds of debt, particular kinds of market transactions.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I think that's right in terms of, that sounds right in terms of the direction. I think, you know, the Jubilee metaphor does, I think, two things. I mean, sometimes it has a illusory, it has a promise that there can be a blank slate and that you can have one solution that then clears everything for, I mean, it somehow gets us out of politics and is in that sense that there can be some single solution that moves us into some different kind of logic. But it also has, I think, a positive value of sort of interrupting the everyday, and perhaps reparations, the reparations demand does the same work. And presumably that, however, could be different in different contexts. And you cannot have a single notion, whether it's reparations or Jubilee or whatever, that would work in all of these contexts, given how extensively debt is part of our lived reality in and the legal system and our structures, and as I was arguing, even our notions about, you know, what is hopeful and what should produce despair, our own ideas about the future or memory, are also fundamentally shaped by different kinds of debt. So that either a single regulatory solution or a single social movement solution doesn't seem like this. Seems like it doesn't seem quite compelling. But at the same time, I think the notion of Jubilee is useful in saying that we should at least find multiple locations of those things and occupy maybe one, as Radhika brought up, the particular notion of buying debt, and maybe Elizabeth Warren is another, and Bernie Sanders is yet another. But each of the Chilean student is another, or Argentina not paying its debt, or Brexit, or Oxy, or whatever is all of those are different versions. But I think I think to think of a single solution or is to fundamentally underestimate how significant debt has become in structuring both personal debt and sovereign debt and everything in between.
I mean, I think that that's right. You have to work with the politics that you have rather than the politics that you want. I mean, we have all these opportunities. It seems foolish not to take them. But I do think that it's an invitation to dream bigger than we've been allowed to. I mean, I like the Arundhati Roy quote, and the discussion that she's having there is about the frontiers of the possible, and in particular some of the more pernicious parts of human rights being that often they can be individualized. Now, Karen, we've had discussions about whether community rights actually can feature into the human rights framework, and actually, insofar as they can, there's a really interesting moment there where community rights over property then stop individual property rights doing the evil that they do. Because if a community holds rights over property, or if certain things are owned by Pachamama, or if that relationship of the world is self-owning and human beings have no reason or have no purchase in having specific bits of property linked to specific individuals. If we can bust that open, I think that ends up being a much more interesting way of thinking about the law and rights and property. But I mean, for my part, I think that there's the interesting conversation here then becomes not around do we have a world with individual property rights owners, but how is it that we dream a world where the relationship of individuals and properties is far more tightly circumscribed, and that there are other entities that either own or govern the natural world that aren't about the traditional capitalist relationship of property ownership.
Okay, I'm afraid we're out of time. I know you'll want to join me in thanking our panel.